Welcome, Doubts Aloud listeners. And today, a little bit different in phraseology, we're going to say welcome to the book club. And the reason I say that is that we're going to be looking at a book by the historian Tom Holland called Dominion. And this is an interesting book, and it will be one of probably other books that we do. And Ed's going to be leading this one. And we're going to start talking about the meeting that Ed and I went to with Tom Holland, the historian, who has this book called Dominion, which is talking about the very positive aspects of Christianity in early church history and through history. And it's kind of taken off in a way in certain circles. So we're going to be looking at this book today. So Ed, lead off on this, please.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Actually, it was Francis who got us onto the idea of doing a book club over this book. And actually, Francis, what were your reasons for thinking it was a great book for us to do?
Because it had caused a big stir amongst apologists, and there were so many Christian apologists online who were full of the Tom Holland book. I would like to make one point, I hope without appearing to be too pedantic or small-minded, but Tom Holland, I always take issue with him being described as a historian. He is probably better described as a popular historian, because when you describe someone as a historian, that suggests that they have had some formal level of training in the historical method. And Tom Holland, although is a writer, he's first and foremost a writer who has a great interest in history and has written a lot of books, factual books about history, but he has no formal training and no formal qualifications as a historian.
So I thought we'd start by talking about Tom himself, and a way in is this meeting that Andrew and I went to in early March at Westminster Chapel. And it was good because it was actually, we were slightly imposters because it was for church leaders. It was called a Church Leaders Round Table. And there were round tables.
Yes, actually there were. Yeah,
Westminster Chapel.
Blast from the past, that was worship meeting and everything. Yeah.
So, any thoughts you had on that meeting, or Tom as a person?
Oh yeah, I mean, he's very, very good speaker. Very, I think, sort of lively and engaging, and I think very, very interesting. But I think that the concept. I mean, obviously, I can see it was very interesting to get it into an almost evangelical meeting there. To see why, you even had yelps from the audience, didn't you? Various points. Did you notice that? You noticed that? It was like, but also the other way, when he said something a bit shifty with someone going, whoa, when he said that he preferred some of the Roman.
Oh, that's right. Yes,
better than Jesus on a cross. What kind of miserable thing? And they were, you actually had visible sounds of positivity and negativity, like almost to the point of slight heckling, but not quite. And at least I thought that. But I think that he touched onto the subject very lightly, and it made me have a lot of questions because what he's saying is obviously very positive things as a sort of a neutral agnostic. Not an atheist or a Christian, it seems to me, sort of somewhere in the middle of. I think he used the term, didn't he? I'm somewhere between.
Yes, that was lovely. I was so. I made sure I wrote it down word for word, and he said, "I am midway between belief and unbelief."
You gospel writer, you Ed, getting it word for word accurate.
And I had Maggie with me.
They could have done with you in the first century.
Yeah, they could have done with you back in then. That's what I'm saying. Let me get it right. Get your notes out.
Yes, yep. Help my unbelief, all that sort
of stuff. That's right.
And we went with Maggie as well, my wife.
Yes.
And she's a Christian and very keen to know more. And she went up to him and asked him one-on-one what would get him like the final step to believe. And he replied to her, "A miracle would do it." So that might be word for word, but that's what Maggie reported, and I wrote that down on the night too. So I think it's good. I think it was good to tell his story because we've got plenty of time. We don't have to rush.
I mean, I would just say that it just opened up questions because you come away from that thinking Christianity is kind of the amazing force in the world that kicked off and transformed the world, and I was immediately thinking, but what about the imminent end that Jesus taught and it didn't happen? And was there the plan from the beginning to go all through history as this amazing force? And then what about the violence in in history, and all these questions came to my mind. He didn't seem to speak of the negative aspects of Christianity, but then maybe he didn't need to, because that's all in the book. So
there is a lot in the book.
Exactly. So therefore, it just made me think of those things rather than just thinking this is an amazing talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we have that chat afterwards where you mentioned that the way that Jesus was almost free to do this ridiculously hard moral ask of people, to give away all your possessions, because he believed that the end of the world was about to come, that the kingdom of God was at hand, and that meant, the winding up of the age. And so then Christianity got successful and influential, and then Jesus didn't come, and so the culture was left with these ridiculously overextended moral asks kind of inbuilt in the culture, which has been.
So he acknowledges that in the book, then?
No, actually, I didn't notice that in the book,
because Asa Grayling took him to task on this, on the debate on Unbelievable with Justin Brearley, probably about 2 years ago now, maybe. And I've just been, I listened to it then, or some of it then, and I listened to it again. And they were really getting quite strong in debating, actually. And one of the points, it wasn't so strong at this point. Asa Grayling was just outlining this original apocalyptic, soon coming, Paul's writings, and it didn't happen. And he said exactly what you just said, that this end apocalypse didn't happen. And in the whole thing of it changing, it then changed to sort of have people have views that were ready for the long term and to go through. And Tom Holland never really responded on that. He just went on to another subject. I was hoping it would all be in his book, because I thought if that's how Christianity started, what chances luck had come into the fact that it did turn out to be such a positive thing in many ways in history, but it wasn't necessarily the plan. Do you see what I mean?
Tom, as a historian, is definitely not saying this was the plan.
Right. Okay. So he's not saying it was the plan, because I'm coming to this like many of the audience here who wouldn't have read the book, but I have listened to a lot of what Tom Holland has been saying, and of course went to that meeting. So to me, I
think the apologist line is, look, the historian Tom Holland is saying we got here, and it looks like we got here by random chance, and aren't we lucky? And but actually there was a grand plan behind it. But Tom's never saying that.
Tom's never saying that.
No, I mean, he is still sticking. He is still sticking to his position that he doesn't say that Jesus was the Son of God. What he says is that people. I mean, I wasn't at the talk, but that's what I'm getting from the book. But we're going to do a bit more of a deep dive into the book later. But he's just saying it. Things panned out the way they did, not through any plan, but it was just because of a combination of circumstances that took us in this direction.
He calls it the Christian Revolution, and he's talking about its effect on our values and all that sort of thing. So it does contribute to that, but he doesn't sort of spell it out the way that we've just done.
And that we're all living off, even today, very much so. We're all living off the back of. Well, I've always thought this anyway. We're all living off in the West anyway, the back of Christendom. It's in our mother's milk. That's the essence, isn't it?
That's very much. That's very much. His,
and so whether we realize it or not, we are living off the back of Christendom, which I like to call Christendom rather than Christianity myself. But okay,
I'm really keen, because I'm assuming that a large proportion of the people listening haven't read the book, and so I'm really keen just to very briefly give Tom's story so that we've all got bearings as to what's going on. So he grew up in a kind of mildly C of E, wishy-washy sort of Christian household, never took it very seriously. He then, as a teenager, got into more and more teenagery, strident-y unbelief, and then was very dismissive of the wet, wimpy Christian message compared to the more macho, interesting, heroic ancient Romans and Greeks. Like it's his second love after the first love of dinosaurs. And then he realized slowly that his values, when he's critiquing, I think he was critiquing some ISIS values, ISIS as in the sort of 2014 Islamic
Yes, he
jihadi
mentioned that
thing.
in one of the things I listened to. Yeah.
He realized that actually his values are contingent as well, and so the book and the quest sort of to understand his values kind of ran in parallel. And he even said that as he went through church history, looking at the way the church has influenced society, he went to the kind of church that was the kind of modern day equivalent of the church he was writing about. So in the Reformation time, he went to a very Reformationist sort of church and that sort of thing. And he's ended up as we said, half belief and unbelief, member of the congregation at St. Bart's, which is a sort of smells and bells church next to the hospital in the middle of London. And he even had, now they're getting this from Justin Brierley, who very recently has written a Spectator article, which might be of interest, it'll be in the show notes, where he launches off about Tom and is trying to say Justin's latest thing is the way that there's a sort of revival of Christianity.
Yeah, I think there's a move towards loosely towards Christianity.
Yeah, so it's about a quarter about Tom Holland, this thing, this article, but it's got all the usual suspects of Jordan Peterson and people like that. And it talks about how Tom nearly had a cancer diagnosis. It was sort of, isn't it, in December 2021. And he had a desperate prayer to the Virgin Mary and came through with it without it being diagnosed. And so he still stays as somewhat of a skeptic. And there you go.
Well, that could be the miracle he was looking at.
Why particularly the Virgin Mary? That's sort of interesting. If he was...
the culture of the church he goes to, maybe, or maybe he had a Catholic. But I don't think he had a Catholic background.
Yeah, I think.
Oh yes, as a child.
Wishy-washy C of E.
Maybe I'm making it up. Maybe it was Catholic, but my impression is it's just he likes St. Bart's. He likes the smells and bells and stuff. And
but maybe that could be the miracle.
They are very high church C of E, and that's the sort of thing they do.
Because he said to Maggie apparently he wanted a miracle, and you could interpret this as a miracle.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't. Interesting.
He again, it's mentioned in the Justin Brierley Spectator article, and he says it wouldn't sway a hard-headed skeptic.
Yeah.
And he must be a hard-headed skeptic because he's not swayed that this is.
He's not swayed by that.
He's not swayed by his experience. He's just pleased he hasn't got cancer.
Yeah. Fair enough. Okay. Interesting.
Have we talked about, I think, what he thinks of his book in relation to being an apologetics book?
You haven't mentioned that yet, no.
But I think
he did talk about that, Andrew, didn't he?
I think briefly, I can't quite remember, but all I'd say is that it's books like this has happened before, where apologists, evangelicals, conservative fundamentalists will love it when a known officially non-Christian writes something incredibly in support of your faith. And it could be in other areas. I've known ones with there's a historian called somebody Rolston or someone who does this alternate archaeology that supports the Exodus, and he goes around all over the place in the States, and he's written books and everything else because it supports against the mainstream of skeptics over the Exodus, for example. Now, I'm not saying there's a link of total parallelism here, but I'm just saying that that when someone can find someone who hasn't got an axe to grind because they're in the faith, it's incredibly useful as a tool. And I think some people are starting to use his book that way, even against what Tom Holland would actually say he would like.
Yeah, he said as much, I thought.
Yeah, that's he did. He doesn't want them to use it that way, but it will be, I can assure you.
Well, we'll do some quotes from it.
Yeah,
and you'll probably see what he means. He mentioned this question I thought was interesting, of what his prediction of the future was, and he wasn't very clear. He thinks one of the options is that the kind of Reformation, the 60s style Reformation away from Christianity and towards sort of a new, what you call vibes, morals that have the kind of legacy of Christianity in them, will get stronger and Christians will become permanently opposed by the kind of mainstream. He thinks the sort of a might is right style, that right back to kind of Roman times stuff, might return. I can't see that happening. And then the other
what meaning by what might is right?
I think might is right was that the kind of Romans were quite happy that slaves were nobodies because of the people in power deemed it so. That's what I assumed he meant.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
And then the third is like a kind of another revival back to Christianity, a stronger return to Christianity, like Wesley's time, or I don't know when we've had them in the past in the West.
Well, that's interesting that you got that kind of surrounding information about where he is now and, you know, how he came to his current position. Now, Ed and I have read the book, and Andrew, you've done more general research around it. Yeah. But perhaps as the two people who've read the book, Ed, what did you, just forgetting about the argument that he's putting forward, just as a way of sitting down and passing the time, what did you think of the book? Was it a good read from as far as you were concerned?
It started so and got less and less, as particularly I think maybe the turning point was the Enlightenment. So we started way early, before the Roman Empire, ancient Mesopotamian Empire, and then we pretty quickly got into the Greeks, and then it became Rome, and then Christianity, and it carries right through to sort of Me Too movement. I guess it's about one of the last sort of events in main history that got mentioned. So it's a massive sweep, and so around about the Enlightenment, I was enjoying it up to that a lot. I love books that have a big sweep of history, and I was learning stuff like Abelard. I barely heard. Just the name I recognised, and I knew absolutely nothing about him. Wouldn't know when he lived or anything. It was lovely to learn about some new things, and for his themes to sort of come and go. I was enjoying all of that, and I felt it started getting more and more polemical from about the Enlightenment onwards, where he was trying to squeeze everything into being, Christianity is caused both sides of this argument, and I found that more and more getting on my goat a bit. So I wasn't enjoying it towards the end, and it became a bit of a chore to finish it off.
Right. That's really interesting, because I sort of moved in the opposite direction. I didn't enjoy it. I did not enjoy reading it. I found it quite irritating I found his style of writing quite irritating. He has he has a deliberately convoluted style of writing things. And there's a sort of faux medievalism, or, King James Bible vibe going on in what he says. So just take a small example. One of the things he says is of one of the Christians called Joachim. The ages of the world, so he had taught, were threefold. I mean, why not just say he taught that the world was going to have three ages? I mean, why do you have to pretend yourself that you're some medieval person? I just found that quite intrusive and irritating. And at one point, I know this sounds incredibly small-minded, but it was something that kind of stopped me, and I had to think about, what does he mean by this? What does this sentence actually mean? He writes, "It was hardly unsurprising then that in the first throes of the revolution," this is the French Revolution, "that many Catholics, in their bewilderment and disorientation, should have suspected that it was all a Protestant plot." He starts, "It was hardly unsurprising," but surely he doesn't mean that. Surely he means that, because to say it was hardly unsurprising means it was surprising, and he doesn't mean that. He means it was hardly surprising. But because he's so, to my mind, in love with complicating things and introducing double negatives. He got himself confused, and he ended up saying something that surely wasn't what he meant, and which sort of made it difficult for me as a reader to interpret what he was saying. But those are just a couple of examples. I could provide many, but that would make this a particularly tedious program, I suppose, if I would go through sort of saying, "Oh, I didn't like this," and what about that? That was rubbish. But I found that very tiresome. As the book went on, I warmed to it to this extent that I had to have respect for the huge scale of the book and the fact that he had managed at all to pull all these disparate strands of what was going on within Christianity together, to make any kind of coherent whole. The other interesting thing was that I found the first bit boring. It wasn't until it got to...
Didn't you like that way of killing people by putting them in a boat and then another boat on top of them and keeping them alive, feeding them, and they get eaten alive by rats underneath?
Oh, I've even forgotten that.
It seems like Ed, got bored at the end, and Francis got bored at the beginning.
Yes, I was. That here and there were bits, but I mean, I just sort of felt a lot of it was like, this person came along and they thought this, and the next person came along and they thought that, and I just found it quite boring until it got to round about Luther and Calvin, and I found that quite interesting. And then, so there was a bit where it was interesting, and then it got boring again as we continued towards the 20th century. So that was my...
Yes.
Also, I mean, perhaps we'll go into this a bit more. I found that the amount of sort of flourish that he put in meant that I just never felt I was reading history. I always felt this person is primarily a novelist. They're not being dispassionate and factual. They're putting in all these flourishes and these touches, like describing how after book burnings, I can't remember who was burning the books, but anyway, whoever it was.
Well, it came up, yeah.
They said as they walked away, the ashes skittered around like, I don't know, like random birds or something like that. And I just
thought, she did a lot of that sort of stuff.
Yes, that's right.
It's funny because I quite like that because it's not a history book telling you what happened. It's sort of weaving a narrative.
I agree.
From it all.
You see, that was what I didn't like.
Yes.
I wanted it to be a history book.
Yeah,
and for me to feel I can rely on this person. They're telling me the facts, and I just never felt that. I just felt,
yes, okay. So
spinning a yarn.
Yeah. So when I was feeling he was getting more and more polemic, again, that I reacted in the way you were reacting right from the beginning of not trusting him in quite the same way. Because like when he talks about Bede, I love Bede, and I read his book, his famous book on the English Church, and I felt that he treated it really fairly and accurately, and so I stayed loyal.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I'm sure of a huge book, it would be surprising if most of it weren't accurate. But, how much those accurate bits supported what was supposed to be his grand ultimate thesis might be another question.
Well, I guess if you've got a grand narrative and you try and tell it with a grand style, as soon as the people start losing trust in your grand narrative, they start getting annoyed by your style.
For the audience then, could you just sum up, perhaps in a paragraph, what the grand narrative is, just to refresh the essence of that narrative?
Well, as I felt it was getting more and more polemical, can I say what I felt what the polemic was arguing for?
Yeah.
And Francis, you can say if you disagree with any of these. So there's three big things he's trying to say that are all connected. The first one is basically today we are all still children of Christianity. So he would say even atheism or woke culture, say, are sort of Christian cults, is how he would put it. And for example, the culture wars are a Christian civil war. So that's his first idea, that everything is Christian. We can't get away from our Christian culture. And so the woke person is being influenced by the teaching of Jesus, say, in one way, and the person they're railing against, who's wanting to stick by being, say, banning gay marriage or something, is equally being influenced by Christianity. So that's what we mean by the sort of Christian civil war.
Mm-hmm.
That's his first point.
So how would that work then? You mean the woke group themselves in today's culture is in fact what reacting against Christianity, and that's how they can do it.
But they are being a corner of Christianity. They are like the kind of ultra Ebonite, follow Jesus as an ethical teacher who massively favors the underprivileged and the oppressed.
Oh, I see.
Yes,
Yes,
their sort of values of
Yes.
considering that the underprivileged need to be respected and protected are Christian values, and without Christians, we would never have had those values.
And very
so there would be
fundamentalist.
no,
very fundamentalist as well with it. It's like shooting people down if you don't follow. Very, very like
on a mission to change the world. That's a Christian
Mary
idea.
Whitehouse back in the 70s kind of grouping that would rally against this going on. The only thing is, I presume, is that these groups then have things that fly in the face of general Christian teaching, so it's the other way around again.
Yes.
Well,
but don't we think that the Trump evangelicals have loads of things that fly in the face of Christianity as well?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So that's why it's
even the politics, perhaps. Yeah.
The culture war. There's a Christian civil war. That's it's good to understand the argument before we try and say no, he's got it wrong in any way.
Mm. Oh yeah, absolutely. So that's the argument. Okay, fair enough.
So that's point one.
Yeah.
Point two is like taking from that. So Christianity is responsible for our views, like the value of all humans, and support for the oppressed, human rights, that we're making progress towards, a better future. All these sort of things we take for granted as what are universal truths almost, are in fact from our Christian past.
Right.
Okay. And then the third one, which is where I really don't agree, or I want to argue against it for sure, that these things are contingent or were contingent. They needn't have happened the way they have happened. So, for example, if we'd stayed in a Greek and Roman culture and Christianity had never happened, and we progressed through time from then, we'd have a very different set of moral values and assumptions compared to the ones I just outlined, about human rights and support for the oppressed and that sort of thing. So that's his contention. So that we've got Christianity to thank for where we are now.
Yes, I think one of the probably one of the reviews I read, but certainly some summary of his argument was that we are swimming in Christianity in the way that a fish swims in water. So we're not even aware of Christianity because it is so completely our environment that we can't even sort of separate ourselves from it or sort of recognize that we're in it because it's too all-encompassing.
Yes, that's a really good way of putting it.
That's interesting. That's interesting because way back, probably about 10, maybe even 15 years ago, I heard of the term Christian atheist, which I thought was an oxymoron at the time. But actually, I think what some people were saying when they used that term was the fact that we are ever so much, even in conflict with Christendom, or we're opposing it, but you need it to oppose. And it needs to be there as a thing, as a backdrop. I don't believe this because it believes that, and yet you're still in relationship with it, and so it's there all the time. And I think that's what people were probably trying to communicate when they talked about being a Christian atheist, because you can't get out of it. We're in the water. The water is Christian, even if you don't like it.
Yes.
And you don't realize it sometimes. You just say we just need to get rid of the water, but can we? Could you you need it in one sense.
Here's another lovely analogy that it got me annoyed, so it must be a good one. After Darwin, there was this famous Bishop Wilberforce debating Darwin's bulldog Huxley, within a year or two of the publication of The Origin of Species.
Yeah.
And Wilberforce tried to make fun of the view that we're all descended from apes, and fairly quickly he was the kind of butt of the derision for having such silly views. And Tom says, well, actually, the atheist who is railing against that Christianity is his parent, as his in the same way that monkeys are the parents of us, is equally silly when viewed from the outside.
Right.
So that's quite a good.
What's he said? Sorry, I mean, I remember. I sort of do vaguely remember that bit from the book, but he's saying that when we atheists rail against Christianity, we are being as silly as Bishop Wilberforce was.
We're railing against the idea that we're descended from Christianity. In the same way that Bishop Wilberforce was against the idea that he descended from an ape.
Yes, okay.
So we haven't moved beyond Christianity. It's like, like I say, if apes are still around, how could we evolve from them? Which is silly, because it's a common ancestor. So you're trying to argue that Christianity and it is all been part of our history, and it's now alongside us, with us, in us.
Yes, and do we carry on it, or we'll be carrying on the Christian story? We're not.
Yeah, we're riding the surf wave of Christianity or Christendom. Yeah.
Yes.
All of us, whether we like it or not. Yeah.
And he actually said on the Westminster Chapel night that there were only two counterexamples. I've not heard this in the book. Do you remember this? That he said that Darwinism is actually, or the ideas in Darwinism don't necessarily go back to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And then he said the same of Nazism.
Right.
So again, that's
interesting.
But people who are really keen on Darwin, they say, "Oh, thanks a bunch."
Yeah, and some people would say that Nazism hijacked elements of Darwinism and used it in a very different way than.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Oh yes, that's exactly. Something that he certainly an idea that he pushes in the book.
Yeah.
I was very surprised that he said, because he was very much encouraging Christians to sort of embrace what you've got. Don't be different from culture. Stand up to what you believe. Do you remember that at the meeting? You've got something to offer. Don't succumb to the oddly enough, to the secularization of the world, basically, because he's feeling that we all bow down to it. But I thought immediately, hang around, what exactly are you saying? Because Christianity is so diverse anyway. Which one are you going to pick? And also, does that mean, what we've got to offer is we stand by the Bible, homosexuality is a sin? Is he saying that? We believe in eternal conscious torment.
No, I think he wanted to.
Don't believe in your God. What's he saying to hold to?
I think he was wanting to partly just to concentrate on the like the crucifixion and maybe the resurrection.
Right. Okay.
Of the kind of underdog, innocent victim we all support and applaud, and then he's risen from the dead, and isn't that marvelous? So part of that. And it is quite a subversive message compared to the Roman culture at the time. Which I thought was quite a good, powerful part of the book. And the other thing he said on the night that I don't think is in the book really is he thinks Christians should talk much more about their wacky stuff of miracles.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Their wacky stuff.
Yeah,
but some of that wacky stuff,
but not wacky stuff in terms of women should submit to men, but wacky stuff. Right. Okay. Miracles and. Right. Yeah, weird beliefs, the virgin birth.
Okay.
And why is he so keen on that? Why is he so keen on that? What difference does it make to him?
Well, I thought what was really helpful was he said in the early lockdown of the pandemic, the church leaders stood up and they sounded like an arm of government. They sounded like Chris Whitty or somebody saying, we must not meet together and keep well apart and wear your face mask and that sort of thing. He said, no, okay, but the church should have something a lot more strong to say in this moment of national crisis than
just joining everyone
follow
else.
The rules. Yeah.
Otherwise, he was probably saying like, you lay at the slightest hint of crisis, you lay down the magic and then follow everyone else. You know?
Yeah.
And,
yes. Well done,
isn't it? It's like you're praying for a miracle, but then someone there falls over and breaks an arm, so you rush them straight to hospital, and so you join the crowd. Yeah, so he was probably, that was his emphasis, but I took it as like, what wackiness do you mean? Surely you're not going to advocate homosexuality being a sin as a key thing in Christianity, which it is for some people, though. Let's hold on to that. Let's not succumb to the culture of equality for women, in the sense that some people hold the Bible doesn't see it the way that the general culture does. So it was trying to say not to be swallowed up by the culture, but I thought, wow, what does that mean in practicality? But again, you didn't take it the same way as me, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I took it more about, okay, so which wacky things are you going to keep,
Yes.
and what argument are you going to make? But we'll get rid of that one and this one. And by the way, we have to get rid of young Earth creationism. Even nothing like that was being said. So,
yes. Well, yeah. One of my critiques is that it's such a broad, well-stacked table of goodies.
Yes.
That whatever you come up with, Christian can say, "Oh yes, we've got this here. This is that pot on the left at the back. You're taking it from us."
Yes, exactly. And so, yeah, people would take those comments, even as we even saw them differently. Other Christians would take those comments and see it as validation for their denomination.
I've got a suggestion.
Yep.
That we actually read out some passages, little bits here and there, and talk about them. Because, again, I'm assuming that most people haven't read the book and want to get a flavour of it to see if this is something that they like to read. And it sort of brings things up. So I've chosen some passages that, just as I was reading, they struck me, and I put a bookmark in, and then I've got them ready for us to read out. The first one that struck me was on the Christian Revolution, a term we've mentioned, how that impacted on some aspects of sex. And so this is around about 1450 we've got to, and for reference, it's on page 275. And who's going to read this quote?
I'll read it, shall I?
Great.
So almost 1500 years after Paul, the notion that men or women might be defined sexually by their attraction to people of the same gender remained too novel, too incomprehensible for most to grasp. In matters of the flesh, as in so much else, the Christian Revolution still had a long way to run.
I guess what struck me was the 1500 years and the idea of a Christian Revolution still having a long way to run after 1500 years. It seems a bit of an oxymoron. So I see what he's saying, that there's this, it's like a embedded, like almost like a parasite or something growing inside you, and slowly it's beginning to have its effect after a long time. So this is the idea that from Romans chapter 1, where Paul talked about the punishments and stuff on people men who lusted after men and women who lusted after their own kind. And apparently that was the first sort of hint of anything in human culture of beginning to be defined by your sexual attraction rather than sexual practices. And so that idea was sort of festering away in the background, as it were. But even 1500 years later, there's been no obvious outworking of it. And so the Christian Revolution still had a long way to run, even if it had been running for 1,500 years.
It reminds me of similarity with slavery.
Yeah, I think it's very similar argument that he uses on slavery. I think one of the, from memory, one of the points he picks out about what Paul says in the letter, which I can't name, and I know one of you two is going to be able to name it because you're so much better at these things, where he talks about, men sleeping with men and women with women, is that it's the first time that there's been a kind of equality of what's expected in terms of women's behavior with other women, whereas nobody had ever said. I mean, this was something that we actually dealt with it when we did our show on homosexuality in the Bible. That in the Old Testament, there's nothing about women sleeping with women. So Paul was kind of revolutionary in a sort of reactionary way, by saying, well, not only is it wrong when men do it, it's also just as bad when women do it. Whereas the Jewish view had been that it was not desirable, but it wasn't just awful, like men sleeping with other men.
Yeah.
So,
because it wasn't a threat to the sort of hierarchy of
that's right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Different thing. But it's interesting to be able to talk about the Christian Revolution after 1500 years, still not there. The Christian Revolution still a long way to run. So if you look at that with, say, slavery as well, you're thinking, what you'd have to question, what do you mean by revolution? Because it'd have to be other aspects to say, actually, there was revolution in this area, but this one took thousands of years. In fact, a lot of critics of Christianity helped in the revolution, so he seems to be hinting himself that he would be for same-sex attraction as something to get to, as a noble.
What you mean, acceptance of same-sex attraction? Yeah.
He's not saying after 1500 years we still haven't gone back to Paul, who was thoroughly against sexuality. He's not saying that, is he? He's saying that it's even in this particular aspect is a long way to go.
I don't think he's saying it's got an end goal in mind, that it's inevitably going to get there. Due to the ideas within Christianity.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, I don't know whether he has in mind that the kind of more liberal Christian view is that because people can be identified in terms of their attraction to their own sex, that is what's changed, that we now have better understanding of it. Whereas for Paul and for people living in, the 1450s, roughly, these people were simply being awful, self-indulgent, wicked people. It wasn't that they had, that was in their nature, that they would be like this, and therefore they were simply expressing their own way of love. It was that they were deliberately defying God by doing the dirtiest, nastiest thing they could think of in sexual terms. Yeah. So I think is that what he's getting at? That there had, although that isn't really an outworking of Christianity, that is more an outworking of science and our understanding of psychology. But I don't know, maybe that's what he's getting at. I'm not quite sure. I mean, in terms of slavery, where it is very similar. I don't have a specific quote to deal with this, but it does seem to me that he does underplay the extent to which Christianity was used in support of slavery. I mean, Christianity was on almost every social question: women's rights, these more recently gay rights, slavery, probably the death penalty. Christianity is such a, no pun intended, such a broad church. You're always going to get people on both sides.
It finds itself on the ends of both arguments.
That's right. So whichever side wins, you're always going to be able to say, Christians always said this. This is what Christians have been about all along, and that's what people say about slavery. Although I have to say, if you're using the Bible, the pro-slavery people had the better argument. I mean, the Bible does support slavery.
A lot of the American books at the time, they really used the Bible's narrative, the Word of God, to say, look, this structure is of God. And then you had people over in England competing with that, with the whole Wilberforce. And all of the in God's image and all of everything else, Yes, and so
there were arguments that could be made on both sides, but there were very good arguments for being
on both sides, and that's why they created the slave Bible. They got rid of all the ones that the anti-slavery people were using, and left all the ones that had all the slavery in it that could be used to support that view. And it's like, okay, so even if at best you've got the Bible is speaking with two voices at different times anyway, and Paul didn't give the death blow we needed. Paul himself didn't give the death blow we
no,
needed.
he didn't. No, well, nor did Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we've got something coming up. I've got a quote coming up about the Islam reaction to abolishing slavery and everything.
Okay,
I found a very interesting companion piece to what you've just been discussing.
I just wanted to say
so we could jump out of order and look at that now.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, okay. Just can I just say that in the American South, many pro-slavery people said that the fight for slavery was a fight against atheism. They specifically identified abolitionism with atheism. They said, abolitionists are all atheists.
So I think it was Thomas Paine, one of the forefront atheists, was really behind the abolitions. And of course, it's like when people today associate evolution with atheism. Do you know what I mean? They say it's just the one thing. Atheism is evolution, which isn't true for many millions of Christians. But to do that is what they did. We associate abolitionists with atheism, which is a shock, isn't it? Really weird. But you're right. In America, North America, and the southern states of America, that was definitely the case, wasn't it, with writings?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this should be interesting. This is the Islamic sort of parallel story. So if you jump down to how about Islam and its relationship with Scripture, with its Scripture. So I'll do a bit of intro. Andrew, you get yourself ready to read this.
Okay.
So this is the first paragraph of that.
The first paragraph, okay.
Yeah, so we're now in the 1850s. So the British Empire has already abolished slavery for itself. And it's now forcing the Ottoman government in Turkey to ban the slave trade and to stop also the Quran mandated tax on Jews and Christians, which it was operating in its territories. So this is page 416, if people are interested, of the book. And so, Andrew, where you start reading, it's talking about the Ottoman clerics having to justify this to their people, what the British were forcing them to do.
Okay. And the British forcing the Ottoman government to ban the slave trade and to stop the Quran mandated.
Start with a quote. So,
sorry, the quote meaning how about Islam?
The quote starting from circumstances.
It's about 3 lines down.
Oh, right. Sorry. Okay, right. Let's do a pause then. Circumstances, they argued, had changed since the time of the Prophet. Rulings in Islam jurisprudence that appeared to condone slavery, whereas nothing compared to those that praised the freeing of slaves as an act most pleasing to God. The Quran, if it were only to be read in the correct light, would open the eyes of the believer to the true essence of Islam, an essence that now more than 12 centuries after the death of Muhammad stood revealed as abolitionist through and through. Yet this maneuver, for all that it might seem to save the Sultan's face, threatened as well to infect Islam with profoundly Christian assumptions about the proper functioning of law. The spirit of Sunnah, it turned out, might, after all, trump its letter insidiously among elite circles in the Islamic world. A novel understanding of legal properties was coming to be fostered, an understanding that derived ultimately not from Muhammad, nor from any Muslim jurist, but from St. Paul. Okay.
So do you feel that's a kind of Quaker version, Islamic version of the Quakers getting the essence of the Bible without the message of the Bible?
Yeah, I suppose so. It's
that's what made my ears prick up.
Yeah, a parallel. Yeah.
Except do you think that's what Tom Holland thinks? Because I think that he thinks that this was an untenable spin on the Quran, whereas the same spin on the Bible was just spinning it right.
Yes, that's
do you see what I mean? Do you see what I mean? Yes, he's saying that they had to fly in the face of what the Quran actually said and try and persuade people that, this is what the Quran was saying all along.
Right.
Whereas
Yes.
When people said, "Oh, this is what the Bible was saying all along," they got it right. That wasn't
Okay,
the
so
Bible.
this is a big cue for you to read the second paragraph I've put here.
Me.
Yeah, France, you've
Yeah.
got to go. Keep different voices doing the reading. So this is jumping right forward to 2014 and ISIS controlling a sort of almost a bit of mini empire in northern Syria. It was all desperate. It was in the news a lot. This is page 246. So could you read this bit?
Sorry, 496.
496. Sorry, I
Yeah.
didn't. Yeah.
They were following the example of Muhammad when they beheaded enemy combatants and reintroduced the jizya and took the women of defeated opponents as slaves. They were doing nothing that the first Muslims had not gloried in. The only road to an uncontaminated future was the road that led back to an unspoiled past. Only scripture was to count. Yet the very literalness with which the Islamic State sought to resuscitate the vanished glories of the Arab Empire was precisely what rendered it so inauthentic. Of the beauties, the subtleties, of the sophistication that had always been the hallmarks of Islamic civilization, there was not a trace. The God they worshipped was not the good God of Muslim philosophers and poets, all merciful and all compassionate, but a butcher.
So here, I think he's saying the opposite.
You're right. Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
That's so
Here
spell that out.
he seems to allow that there can, perhaps going to have to apply my mind to this, that he can allow that there could be the same views coming from a non-Christian source, the same, that there are Islamic values that are like Christian values, which kind of seems to undermine his point.
So in the first paragraph, taking it literally, it's clearly pro-slavery, and it's a rather silly and insidious sort of way of trying to pretend that it says what it doesn't say when it becomes more liberal, and the message is to stop trading in slaves. And yet, when it's the jihadi style people in ISIS in 2014 taking the Quran very literally and following it as the first Muslims had done, suddenly that was against the spirit of the beauties of Islam and the subtleties of the poets and their philosophers and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes,
he
that's
was
very
trying to the first one
interesting.
say St. Paul's got the answer, and then the second one, the Islam in the correct light has got the answer.
Yes,
Is that
and
the
it's
sort of thing you mean?
yeah, it's the Muslim
Yeah.
By not
philosophers
being
and
a
poets.
literalist.
Yeah.
And interesting. So why not have gone back and said the same thing? Now, if you go back to St. Paul, you'd find if that influenced the Quran a bit better, we wouldn't be getting ISIS, which is whether he was not saying that here, but it's interesting how he sticks with just a different version of Islam here, but not on the first one. Yeah,
Yes.
that is interesting. Yeah.
I don't see how that fits into his general thesis that all these values can only be understood in terms of the development of Christianity. Because if you accept that these values are also there in Islam, then it's clearly not peculiar to Christianity that people have these views.
Yeah. And actually, it was part of his story when he was in northern Syria for a BBC or something documentary, and he saw the brutality of the way that they'd taken slaves and that sort of thing. And it was there that he had almost a religious experience in a bombed out church where he sort of almost saw angels. I think did he mention that?
Well,
maybe it's in the Justin Brierley
I think it's
article.
in the Justin Brierley
article,
which I haven't read in full, but I mean I've read snippets of it, and I know that part of it refers to him having this quasi-religious experience in a bombed out church.
Yeah. So it was having kind of confronted the horror of what ISIS has been up to, that this was like a kind of he felt he had a vision of what the world would be like if Christianity hadn't tamed us all in the West and we were still brutal Romans.
I mean, do you think he's saying that that it was because of the Roman background that Christianity has had, in other words, that Islam coming from an area that was, I don't know, I'm not a great historian, but would it be true to say that Islam came from an area that was relatively free of Roman influence? And what he's saying is that because of the Roman influence in the West, we needed Christianity to get us here, because otherwise the Roman influence would have dragged us down the road to brutality. Whereas the Muslims didn't have that brutalizing Roman influence and were therefore free to develop other ways of looking at the world. Or is it not? Because, I mean, that isn't what...
So.
Really? That's interesting. Because that isn't what comes across to me.
Okay.
But okay, okay. It's a big book. Yep. It's like the Bible. It's a big book. There are numerous interpretations.
Yeah.
And the way we're looking at it, sounds like there's different authors within the one book.
Yes.
Out these, you could argue that it's contradictory things, or someone else is writing another part. Yeah. But it's interesting. This,
Can we do a bit now on violence?
Sure.
So let's back up.
I was like a spot of violence.
Yeah. Nothing like as my being eaten by rats from the early part of the book.
No, I'm really sorry. I've forgotten that bit. I mean, I did read it sort of in two parts. I started to read it, then I put it to one side, and then I went back to reading it when we said we do this podcast. So if it was very early in the book, then
yes,
it will be quite a long time since I read it, which would explain why I've now forgotten it.
Yeah.
However, I'm glad you've reminded me, because I can have nightmares for for the next week.
Okay, so this is now about the 1830s, and we've got things going on in Europe.
1630s, I think.
Sorry, 1630s. Sorry. We've got things going on in Europe, and we've got things going on with the Pilgrim Fathers in America. So we'll do Europe first. And I think this is the worst war ever. It's the 30 Years' War, and it's all basically around the German states, but it's spread. And it's like a kind of massive, what do they call it? Like a mill grinder. What's it? A sausage grinder. What's it? When you make a mince meat.
Well, I think
meat grinder.
A meat grinder.
Massive meat grinder that lasted
millions
30 years.
Died.
Anyway,
it was just
and it was very much a religious war, unlike many
Protestant
wars
Catholic,
that were about grabbing territory. This really was a religious war. And so, Andrew, I'm allocating you. This is page 324 of the book.
Okay. Christian teachings, far from blunting hatreds, seemed a whetstone. Millions perished. So this is referring to the 30 Years' War. Wolves prowled through the ruins of burnt towns, atrocities of an order so terrible, as one pastor put it, those who come after us will never believe what miseries we have suffered, were committed on a numbing scale, men castrated, women roasted in ovens, little children led around on ropes like dogs.
So that's the way that the Christians treated each other, basically Catholics against Protestants, and this sort of war just kept going, and they just kept suffering. I think was it something ridiculous, like 30% of the population got killed in the war.
Yeah. Oh, it was just unbelievable. People, can't believe it. I mean, even if I know that there's more modern historians who look at it of things going on behind just simply the religious aspects and sort of change perhaps traditional understandings of it, because that is going on right now on the 30 Years' War. But even so, the fact that the Christian Revolution is not doing anything here, because people were literally fighting, probably, why are we fighting them? Oh, they're Catholic, and they believe this and we believe that. And it wasn't all about land or anything like that. In many ways, it was religious differences, you said, Ed. And even if it was getting political and power for land and stuff like that, the fact is it's all mixed together within Christendom with this incredible ability to treat each other as human beings like this, with a full belief in God and Christianity behind it all. I mean, it is incredible to see what Christian can do to Christian. And people are going to say today, oh, you've heard this one, haven't you, both of you? Oh, well, they weren't real Christians, and you always hear that whenever it doesn't live up to so-called Christ-like standards. They're not real Christians, so we're just talking politics and power again. But people have always done that when Christians behave badly.
Yeah. So let's follow the real Christians, which are the Pilgrim
Fathers. Let's follow the real
Christians,
which is
the Pilgrim Fathers in America who had escaped all this persecution, and we're going to build a new Jerusalem in the New World.
And ended up slaughtering.
Yeah. So here they go. So this is page 328, Francis.
Yes.
Okay.
Excellent.
And here they are. They're torching native tribes in their wigwams, just burning them in the wigwams and everything. And off you go.
It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same, and horrible was stink and scent thereof. So that's an early Puritan speaking.
Yeah. That's right.
And then Tom Holland continues. Again, there were Puritans who expressed their disgust, and again they were answered with God's licensing of slaughter in defence of Israel. And this is a quote: "Sometimes the scripture declareth, women and children must perish with their parents," they were assured. "We had sufficient light from the word of God for our proceedings."
Oh my gosh, how close is this to current events? Some people would point out, basically.
Yes, one might see it that way, yes.
Yeah, and you can imagine an ISIS mullah saying that sort of thing.
Yeah, oh, definitely. But I mean, I was referring to the fact in their previous podcast pointed out that Netanyahu had quoted the Old Testament talking about the killing of that included women and children. Yeah. Under the light of this was God's will to the enemies, which is an incredible thing in the 21st century to use. But this is a Christian, Hebrew Bible from that point of view, being used currently for a political situation. And so this sounds very similar to what was going on here. It seems like God and violence often do go together, rather than strands of Jesus' teaching knocking that on their head. It doesn't seem to have stopped it through a lot of church history.
In fact, as Richard Dawkins says, it needs religion to get a good man to do evil.
Yes. Yeah. And in one sense, because we're talking everything is Christendom and we're talking about we're swimming in the water, that water seemed to allow for incredible inhumanity to humanity. It needs somebody to almost try to look outside the water to spot it, because they're all treating each other like this. I mean, there may have been strands of people who condemned it, like little streams of Christianity, like maybe Quakers at some periods in history, or what was it? What are the ones that were known as quite pacifistic back then in the 16th century? The Mennonites.
Oh, right.
And previous to the Mennonites, the Anabaptists. That's it. These people were much more of a pacifistic line compared with the standard forms of Christianity. So they would be the one voice, you could say. They're the ones, but they were drowned. They were drowned by Protestants.
Yeah,
but
they had a little Anabaptist utopia thing going, and it exploded absolutely astoundingly with horrible violence and stuff.
They would drown them. If you believe in Anabaptism,
I forget what it was called. It's mentioned in the book.
Yeah, Tom Holland talks about Anabaptists, and I believe that some Anabaptists were pretty unpleasant people. But again, you had a very broad swathe. I mean, you had some who were completely pacifist and were, very decent people, and then you had others who were just,
who led a riot or something. Yeah.
Yes, and were cruel and so. But anyway, that's the Anabaptists.
The question is how does this Jesus revolution, the Christian revolution, really, why is it today that we are all horrific about these things, but back then this is the way it was,
Well, how how about
Generally
on
speaking.
tolerance? I want to do that one next because this is connected to the 30 Years' War.
Oh, yeah.
So this is at the end of the 30 Years' War. They eventually patched it up, and a tolerance of a kind finally arrived. And so who wants to read this from page 353?
Go on, Francis.
Okay. Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, all were granted the freedom to worship as they pleased. This formula, far from an attempt to banish religion from the workings of the state, constituted the precise opposite, a project to establish a properly Christian order. Rather than a portrayal of Christ, who had urged his followers to love their enemies and to turn the other cheek, it expressed a conscious ambition to measure up to his teachings. Toleration of religious difference had been enshrined as a Christian virtue.
You should have gone to my church.
Yeah.
Well, we just burn people at the stake by books rather than physicality.
Yes.
But different people's churches,
Yeah.
But interesting. Wow.
So the idea is that you have 30 years with this meat grinder, and they're absolutely exhausted and can't just longing to stop, and they cobble together. They go back to the buffet to find what's available, and they think, actually, Christ is saying we should love our enemies, and we should be turning on the cheek, and we need to follow those teachings. And so, of course, toleration was always a Christian virtue that is been part of our faith forever, and that's the most important thing, not being doctrinally perfectly right and keeping God pleased.
Well, again, I can't remember now. Does he provide, when he says that it was rather than a betrayal of Christ, it expressed a conscious ambition to measure up to his teachings? Is there any support for that? Is there any kind of authority quoted for that? Because I would have seen this as a pragmatic decision, that everybody just realised that this is ridiculous. This is not getting any of us anywhere. Let's just accept that we have to learn to live with each other, or we're all of us are going to have to die with each other. And so, I would see this as more a realization, just a completely pragmatic thing.
I think that's what Tom is saying.
But he's saying that it was said that it was a Christian thing, that it wasn't pragmatic. This is actually
that Jesus has said it all.
Yeah, this is what Jesus has taught all along. And I'm not convinced. I'm not saying, I can't go as far as say it's wrong, but I'm not convinced that that was the motivation, that it was actually
exactly. It is
justified as being, this is what the Bible tells us to do. It's more like, we've just each got to allow people to get on with what they want, because otherwise it's not, just practically it isn't working.
Yes, I agree. I think that's exactly what happened, and I think that's what Tom is saying is what happened.
Oh, really?
I do, yes.
But he's saying, rather than a betrayal of Christ, who had urged his followers to love their enemy and turn the other cheek, it expressed a conscious ambition to measure up to his teachings. Toleration of religious difference has been enshrined as a Christian virtue.
He seems to be saying that it strayed from Jesus' teachings.
Yes, he's saying it's a religious. He's saying it's a religious decision, not a pragmatic decision.
But we'd had hundreds of years of the Inquisition and all the rest of it, that were considered exactly what God wanted. That what you believe, the contents of your belief, your doctrine, is massively important, and that's the most important thing in Christianity, not being all a bit hippy dude about a whole range of teachings. And they've been burning heretics at the stake for centuries by this stage.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they didn't continue in, for instance, England. Was heretics still not being burnt at the stake after 1648 in England, which obviously wasn't involved in the 30 Years' War? So if there was a general understanding that Christianity taught that you had to tolerate other religions, then why would heretics have been burnt anywhere? I mean, I just don't. What I'm saying is, I don't think that this decision was based on religion itself. It was just based on pragmatism.
Okay.
Well,
I
don't know, which I
agree
think
with
is
that.
still the case.
I
Still the case
completely agree
today.
with that.
Yeah.
What we
okay.
disagree is how much Tom is hinting
at
us
Paul.
that's what's going on, or if
Jesus.
if he should be read straight that
there is
this was the faith that generated this new change of heart.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a complete parallel to after the Second World War, when the United Nations came together and saying we must come together with international law. Funny enough, that's the current thing right now, isn't it? Because in the past, warfare took this path. It was so brutal, so dehumanizing, that they said, and even the Geneva Conventions came out because it was saying we need some kind of ruling of just war as opposed to brutal, whatever. And that's why today there's so much politics going on about international law. You're breaking international law. It's coming together to say never again for things like the Holocaust, never again for the way, people treated other enemies. There's sort of like a code of conduct even in war, which seems like an oxymoron anyway, but there was. And would you say, they finally, that's a bit like saying after the Second World War, they finally decided to go back to Jesus' teaching, rather than just the human response, as you're saying, never again. Because lots of people were saying never again. It doesn't have to be Christian. But he's saying, I suppose it's in your mother's milk. It's always there in Jesus' teaching.
See, I think love for enemies and things isn't of doctrinal. It's not talking about purity of doctrine and that sort of thing, which is what was driving the heartache and meat grinder of the Protestant Catholic wars.
And there's another spanner in the works anyway, which you probably touch into, that it's actually that's looking forward. He's trying to say these things of Jesus look forward and weren't picked up, and then they were. But what about looking backward? I mean, how much of Jesus' teaching should have been applied to the Israelite soldiers? Do you see what I mean? Back to this again. How much of the brutality of the only good Canaanite is a dead one, and the brutality of God as a tribal warfare God. Does he mention anything like this in the book, that actually even God took an evolution on before Jesus' teaching came out? Or at the time of Jesus, or maybe Jesus Christianized God. Do you see what I mean?
A bit, yes.
To be an ironic way. But if you apply Jesus' love your enemies back to the Old Testament, the book of Joshua, you do have a stark contrast. And it looks like church history often emulated the book of Joshua than it did Jesus, strands of Jesus' teaching from the Mount of Olives, or wherever you want him to be speaking from. So I see a problem going backwards, as well as the fact that it didn't seem to work going forwards. So I think that's a problem within Christianity, though, as opposed to, modern society.
Yeah. Have we got time to do one more set?
Yeah.
Well, what do you mean by set? What?
Another couple of hours.
Some quotes on the theme of liberal Western values.
Maybe.
Do that to wrap it up. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
And then we'll do Dominion Returns later on.
Yes.
Okay. So this is, as I say, the kind of origin and how we've got here with our modern liberal Western values, which is, of course, a key idea. The making of the Western mind is the English subtitle of the book. So now we're in the 1960s and 70s in the USA, and it's page 478. So take it away, Francis.
To campaign against discrimination on the grounds of gender or sexuality, however, was to depend on large numbers of people sharing in a common assumption that everyone possessed an inherent worth. The origins of this principle, as Nietzsche had so contemptuously pointed out, lay not in the French Revolution, nor in the Declaration of Independence, nor in the Enlightenment, but in the Bible.
So that's the sort of standard Holland message.
Yes.
We get a lot of during this part of the book. And now we're moving forward to pretty well the end of the book, 2017, and the Women's March that was about a month or two after the inauguration of Trump. So this is page 513.
Okay. Evangelicals had voted in large numbers for Trump, roiled by issues that seemed to them not just unbiblical, but directly antithetical to God's purposes. Abortion, gay marriage, transgender rights. They had held their noses and back to a man who, pussy grabbing and porn stars notwithstanding, had unblushingly cast himself as a standard bearer for Christian values. Unsurprisingly, then, hypocrisy had been added to bigotry on the charge sheet leveled against them by progressives. America, it seemed to many feminists, risked becoming a misogynist theocracy.
So again, this is more material kind of backing up the big conclusions that we were talking about before. So both sides of the argument, the evangelicals voting Trump in with his anti-gay marriage and transgender rights are all Christian, and those who standing up, the women standing up against them, are kind of keen on for reasons that their Christianity, their Christian sort of culture has been down to them. Maybe that hasn't come out as clearly in this particular quote, but certainly the influence of Christianity right at the end of the book is still as much on the anti-liberal values as on the liberal values. Then this last one is it's covering 2 paragraphs, so you could read through the whole thing, but it is 2 separate paragraphs subsequent to each other in the book. So this is yeah, if you could, what, are you happy to read it again, Andrew?
No, if you read that, I thought, just to spread the voices out.
Oh, okay, I'll do it.
Yeah.
So this is on Me Too, and it's page 515, and Tom is talking about the movement's message and that kind of thing. The human body was not an object, not a commodity to be used by the rich and powerful as and when they pleased. 2,000 years of Christian sexual morality had resulted in men as well as women widely taking this for granted. Had it not, then Me Too would have had no force. The tracks of Christian theology, Nietzsche had complained, wound everywhere. In the early 21st century, they led, as they had done in earlier ages, in various and crisscrossing directions. They led towards TV stations in which televangelists preached the headship of men over women, and they led as well towards gender studies departments in which Christianity was condemned for heteronormative marginalization of LGBTQIA+.
Yeah. I mean, my thoughts about that is that you have to be very careful when he's not that he said it in this particular passage, but like in the one above, he says, we go back to the Bible. Just say for the point we did just earlier on this, you back to the Bible for the equality of men in God's sight. Well, you can't do that in all of the Bible. We've seen in previous episodes the different values of different human beings in the Bible and the subjugation of women in the Bible itself. Like I said, and here the headship and everything else teaching has come from people seriously believing in the headship over women as a Bible declarative thing from creation in the New Testament. And so for some people who read it that way and quite happy to read it that way and work and live that way. And so the Me Too movement, that's a shock really, because again, the rich and the powerful, certainly in the Old Testament over women were kind of property. And seemed to be, a man could dismiss them at a whim and get another wife and, put that one on, put her out with a certificate. And even the passages where it says the Israelites, they can take these women as their wives. They have 2 months to mourn and then they take them. I mean, it's anything but Me Too in a wider Bible, but he's presumably always trying to focus on just Jesus teaching himself, or Paul.
Yeah, he uses Genesis an awful lot, and both male and female created in God's image, and how this is foundational to a change in attitude. But if that was foundational, that was there in the Hebrew Bible. So why in the Hebrew Bible don't we find reflected the attitude that men and women are absolutely equal? I mean, why to me that just didn't make sense, that he would constantly refer to, oh well, because it was there in Genesis, always there in Genesis, all come from the same source.
Yeah,
but that's,
I mean, some people, I know what some people will say. They will argue that that's pre-fall, and so that everything was pre-fall, and then the distinctions afterwards was now Adam will and man will rule over you, and then you will have greater birth pain and all the rest of it. In other words,
yes, but then that applies equally to Christianity. You can't, if that was all set aside, I mean, if that thing about being created both in God's image,
it means they should have been aware that they're in that all of their polygamy was wrong, that all of their treating women this way as property was wrong. Just by the priest that wrote Genesis 1 should have been enough, you mean?
Well, it just means that Genesis 1, if you're going to say, well, the reason why they changed from that equality in Genesis 1 to other parts of the Hebrew Bible where men are very much
dominant,
superior and dominant over women, that was all because of the fall, then exactly the same argument applies to it being used in Christianity. If it, it doesn't follow from Genesis 1 that you have to regard men and women as equal, or if it does follow from Genesis 1, why didn't the authors in the Hebrew Bible spot that? Why didn't they sort of say, oh, we can't have these different rules for women?
Exactly. Because they should have been writing the laws.
They're both created in God's image, both equal.
Why the property? So, why were they property in the first place? And then continued to be property, perhaps, in early versions of church history.
Absolutely.
Right up to husbands who are dominant over their wives based on scripture,
Absolutely,
and some of pseudo Paul's sayings in the New Testament,
And do you remember the episode that you led us on? We called it something like God's Body.
Yeah.
And this verse was very key in that. And it originally was saying, according to many scholars, is that kind of God looks a bit like us with arms and legs and a head and a body.
Mm-hmm. And genitals,
and whether he had genitals or not was a case in point.
Was a case in point, yeah. Some people say yes, some people say no, yeah.
So that's why the Hebrews, who never took it as a philosophical statement about the relative worth of men and women and different tribes across the world as well, it was never taken that way. No, and it's only, it was like I say, the same picture of you've got this sort of buffet with all the dishes on the table, and there it was waiting and looking at the back for you to pick up and use when it suited you.
Yeah.
So, look, from the beginning, God actually had said, some hippie dude in the 60s saying we're all made equal, and then suddenly that's what it's been saying all along, and of course that's the message.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would also say to him, are you criticizing Judaism as well and historical Israel? Because that his criticism should equally apply. He's already admitted that Christianity comes out of Judaism as a source, and Greek philosophy and Roman culture and everything else, that he does admit they're all sources. But then you to say this is a backward criticism as well, that somehow he is arguing then that something about the Jesus himself was the radical thing, not prior Bible, presumably, and Paul, or genuine Paul himself. Is that basically what he's arguing, that those people caused the revolutionary thought compared with anybody else?
I think
not Moses, not Moses or Joshua or even the Psalms, but actually Jesus himself, because maybe he should be more specific to say Jesus all the time as opposed to Bible, because that would be my critique.
Yeah, he thinks Paul had a big thing going.
Yeah. And if he believes that Paul didn't write those books that are more misogynist, then he may, he'd be able to use
he
that.
doesn't think that. He's following standard scholarship.
Standard scholarship. So he'd say,
yeah,
that's where misogynist pseudo Pauls came in against the real Paul. Fine. I mean, that's a good argument to make.
I think he mentions it.
Yeah.
In the way that a Bible scholar who's sort of deep in this stuff would
deep
also
into this, that would actually say, yeah.
So I think he's read up on that and well informed.
Fair enough. Well, that's good, because that at least helps some people get to deal with Paul, because you realise that those letters, later ones, are in many ways significantly different from real Paul. In many ways.
Yeah. So I think, going back to something you said, that the revolution was partly so powerful because the early members thought the world was about to end.
Yeah. I mean, some of those teachings in the Gospels they make sense in the light of an imminent end rather than long life. But on the other hand, they do have these incredible high ideals. Give all your money away. Fine. That makes perfect sense for any cult leader who says the end is coming in 2 weeks. Yeah. They say, give all your money away, but it doesn't make sense in the long term for everyone to do that over thousands of years. And say,
well, they did solve that by becoming monks.
Well, yeah. So somebody's got to do something with the text. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So people, or some became literal eunuchs, didn't they? Because of that passage in the Bible. Yeah. I think there's Oregon, I think, did.
The kind of people who lived up on the top of pillars in the desert.
Pillars and poles and things. Yeah. Certainly people have read these texts and acted on them literalistically in many ways as well. I heard of a missionary friend of mine who came back from, I think it possibly was Thailand or somewhere else in YWAM many, many years ago. And he said he had to deal with people in his church who shaved off their beards to become like children, because it says, unless you become like a child. Yeah. And that's how they read that passage. It's very interesting how different people read texts of the Bible. It's very much a negotiation with the text on how you see it. And we go, don't be silly. It didn't mean that. But they didn't think that. So, and the same with,
that's really, I like that.
Yeah. It was very interesting. What do you mean shave? He said, well, unless you become like a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So I thought, flip, the beard's coming off. And there's an example, just one example of my experience. So hearing that.
Great.
Yeah. Well, there we go.
Okay.
Tom Holland's Dominion.
Yeah. We probably won't do part 2 next month, but it will appear.
No. So next month we have,
I think we're going to be talking about the McGrews with two of our friends who have not been on together before, John Nelson and Josh Parikh.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
And we're talking about the McCrew
phenomenon.
And
there's a husband and wife tag team
in their sort of apologetics and Christian philosophy and biblical stuff, basically. So we look forward to that. And then at a latter point, we'll be doing part 2 on Dominion, this book from Tom Holland.
The Dominion will return.
Yeah, indeed. So hope any of you out there found this interesting, and go and look up that book or read about it or watch some of the YouTube videos of Tom Holland talking about this book of his to do with early and historical Christianity and its revolution. And so until next time, when we do have our 2 new guests on for the next podcast, I have been Andrew, your host.
And I've been Frances.
And I've been Ed.
Bye.